the nonprofit space, they move at generally a slower pace overall. And it's being attuned to that and being understanding of that. If you're thinking more about closing the deal or more about your quota than you are like, what do they need and when do they need it by? That's how it's going to come off.
Welcome to the Domin8 podcast. On this show, we talk with HubSpot's sellers about their latest wins, pulling back the curtain to explore the challenges they ran into, the sales strategies they use to win the deal. I'm Saberin, Senior Partnership Manager for Aptitude8, the world's top technical HubSpot consulting firm. Today on the Domin8 podcast, I have a guest who's mastered two worlds most wouldn't try to mix. He's known as the funniest man in software, spent 8 years on stage as a comedian, and even landing spots on Comedy Central and making the finals at the Boston Comedy Festival. But what really makes this individual stand out is what he's done off stage, especially in the world of software. He's one of the early hires at a little startup we all know as HubSpot 16 years ago when it was just an idea and a company that fit inside a single room. Over those 16 years, Dan's seen it grow into a global force, and he's had a front row seat for all of it. These days, Dan's still combining strategy and storytelling and comedy while selling HubSpot. Dan, Sally, I'm super excited to have you here. And I've got to start with the obvious. How does a stand-up comic end up helping build one of the biggest names in B2B SaaS?
Great question, and thank you for having me. So I started in sales and stand-up at the exact same time. And I will tell you, like, both take tenacity and both take a very high tolerance for rejection. And so they worked really well together. And I will tell you, like, there has never been any situation I've ever been in a sales capacity that has been worse than my worst gig. I will tell you that. Like, none. Absolutely none. So from that perspective, yeah. I feel exceptionally safe where I am now, off the stage and selling.
Yeah. In stand-up, I believe you have seconds to read a room and adjust and alter possibly that script. Do you feel like that is something that carried over to sales that made that feel easier?
Oh, big time. Yeah, big time. I mean, my dad, he was a trial attorney, so he had a lot of experience in high pressure public speaking. And the advice he gave me, this is when I was doing stand-up, is he said, they don't know what you're going to say. So the only person who knows if you messed up is you. And yeah, I think the ability to adjust, the ability to know when things maybe aren't going in the right direction and pivot and get people back on your side. Those are all things I learned in stand-up and things I still apply today.
That's super interesting. I think also comedy in general, it's essentially storytelling. And if you're up on stage, it's under pressure. So how has that component of, storytelling kind of shaped the way you approach sales and then complex sales conversations?
One of the big things I learned with stand-up, and I think one of the things I apply in sales, is having an economy with my words. So thinking about what is the clearest, briefest way I can get a concept across. I think with stand-up, it's more about keeping people engaged, getting to the laughs, keeping the pace moving. In sales, it's more like you're fighting against people's attention spans. And in the case of more complex sales, especially now that HubSpot is more like a platform sale, you're throwing a lot at people in usually what's an hour's time. And so the simpler you can convey that and the simpler you can make that, the better.
That's super interesting. I think it's great advice. One of the things I heard recently is talk in sprints of no more than 10 to 15 seconds to make it a volley. And
yeah.
I feel like that is essentially what you've said there.
Yeah. I think sometimes what happens is we get so comfortable with what we're selling, and this isn't just HubSpot, this could be any product, service, whatever, that you almost take it for granted that the person on the other end of the line knows everything you're talking about. The reality is they're all brand new to this. And so in a lot of cases, you really have to pace the conversation according to the audience you're speaking with. And we can even tie this back into stand-up, where once you get a sense of the crowd you're speaking with, you know exactly where you should be starting off. And again, more savvy prospects, you're going to be able to move a little quicker. You're not going to have to explain things as much. But maybe somebody who's brand new to whatever it is you're selling needs a little more time for education. And so things have to be kept briefer, more digestible, and you really have to check in and make sure they're following you along the way. The one thing that's tougher about sales than stand-up is pretty quickly in stand-up if they're not getting what you're saying. Because if the crowd isn't laughing, that's a problem. But sometimes on Zoom calls, everybody's just sitting there nodding their heads. And if you're not checking in and getting a pulse for where they are, you might very well be losing them and not even know it.
Yeah. So, something you said, making sure that you're essentially checking the room in stand-up to make sure that they're getting and what you're saying. How do you apply that to sales? So how do you make that initial or that early checkup to kind of test how much they understand and are their background with either CRM or HubSpot specifically?
Yeah, a lot of times you can infer it. So if they've already bought software before, so for example, if this is more of a competitive sale and they have an incumbent provider, you generally know they're already familiar with the software itself. They're familiar with what it does. Industry can be a good indicator. There are some industries that are just more tech forward than others. And then, of course, there's the individual as well, just getting a feel for, have you bought software before? Have you used this before? Is this your first time, second time, third time, so on? And in some cases, you could be speaking with a group of people, in which case you really have to move according to maybe the slowest quartile of the audience to make sure you're not missing them.
Yeah. You mentioned HubSpot has changed a lot over time. How has that changed? You've been here for 16 years, so it's changed a massive amount. How has that changed the evolution of how you're selling, the problems you're selling, and that approach?
Whoa, yeah. Yeah. I mean, we were really a much simpler tool when I started. So first off, I want to say this because we're recording this. I found out about HubSpot on Craigslist. So that's early days it was. There was a job posting on Craigslist and I looked it up and I was like, this tech is pretty cool. I've always been attracted to the technology first. And I saw what HubSpot did. I instantly got the value. And then I had an interview and I think was in there like a month after I started talking with them. They moved pretty fast. When I started HubSpot, we were more or less an SEO tool with a blog attached, a landing page creator, and a little email and some analytics. And I had the fortune of being able to learn the platform as we grew. So when we started incorporating sales tools, the CRM, I was able to learn that. When we brought in Service Hub, I was able to learn that. I was able to learn it piece by piece. And so the advantage there is I'm pretty proficient across the platform. I think in terms of selling, it can make qualification a little more challenging because you're dealing with a really broad cross-section of needs. I think that also when you're speaking with multiple teams, it can be a challenge to figure out, okay, how do I present this in the best possible way? And like in a lot of cases, we might be dealing with a marketing team, a sales team, and a service team, in which case you really have to decide, am I going to try to do this in one marathon call, or am I going to break it up into individual audience-specific calls? I'm a fan of the audience-specific calls because, again, nobody has the attention span for a 2-hour call, in my mind. Even me, when I'm doing the demo. Yeah, so I think overall, it gets back to what we talked about earlier, which is you've got this big, large, comprehensive platform. How do you boil down what it does in the simplest possible terms so people understand why we should be going this way instead of maybe just bolting together a bunch of different solutions?
For the sellers, right, there's a lot of sellers that don't have the advantage of, we'll say, growing up and that longer path and just learning the platform as it grew up, essentially. What would your advice be to them that are going from small biz to mid-market or mid-market to an enterprise seller? And what would your advice be to them trying to make that switch, and what has to happen there?
Don't try to learn the whole platform at once. Like, I think you can still learn it piece by piece. And a lot of times when we launch a new feature, really the way I learn it is when I have a chance to sell it. So when a demo, I was actually doing this this afternoon where there are some new AI-enabled features I'm less familiar with that are going to be part of a call I'm on tomorrow. And so I'll just sit for an hour and play around with the tools and figure out what they do and go into our knowledge base and get myself familiar with that little subsection. So I think for folks who might be a little bit newer, might be, again, moving up to more complex sales, I think number one, it's just give yourself time before a demo to learn parts of the platform you don't know. I think that the other thing I'd say too is in a lot of cases, it's not that complex because even though we do a lot, generally what I find is the use cases across teams are pretty universal. So every now and then you get an edge case that maybe is using some particular functionality that isn't one that the majority of use cases need. But for the most part, it's like the same set of tools. Like on marketing, you've got marketing automation, email, and analytics. On sales, you've got deals and sequences and, of course, reporting as well. And on services, you've got tickets and, again, reporting and live chat. So there are a couple of core tools that I think show up in every demo. But again, every now and then you get a fringe case that you really need to adjust for. I think the other thing I'd say more than the feature side is also really understanding how to deal with a larger team, because a lot of times we're looking at the demo for a specific personas problem. And in a lot of cases, you have people with a bunch of different concerns. So for example, the concern of a marketing manager is going to be different from the concerns of a CMO. And that's going to be different than the concerns of a sales rep. And that's going to be different than the concerns of IT and InfoSec folks. And so it's making sure that you're addressing all the different needs and all the different personas in the room in order to make sure that it lands. And I think beyond that, also getting used to doing that like post-call and throughout the sales process, like checking in with all those individual people and making sure what you're saying to them is personalized to their role and what they're most concerned about. Just a great example is he doesn't really care if a tool is easy to use. It doesn't really care if a tool unifies data. What they care about is it's going to make more work for me and is this secure? And so in my communications with IT, I'm really talking more about that, where again, in my conversations with, let's say, marketing manager, I'm focused more on the ease of use side of things or the ease of reporting, things like that.
Yeah. I think the other big factor that comes into play is nomenclature. You can have the same use cases, but nomenclature is one of those things that kind of makes it real to the prospect or the customer that you're speaking with. It's the connector piece, right? If we're trying to gauge that piece there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things I do, and I would say like, some people might disagree with the way I approach demos, but I spend a good 2 hours prepping my demo portals for a specific use case. So I really like to make sure that this looks as close to what it's going to look like when the customer is actually using their own HubSpot portal as possible. And I don't know if this is what you meant by nomenclature, but just like using the prospect's terminology and incorporating that directly into the portal. So there's no gray area there. They don't have to use their imagination at all. They can just come right in and say, okay, this is what we look like using HubSpot.
Yeah. Yeah. I think some of what I was talking about and the deal that I think we recently won together, it was a nonprofit. So in the nonprofit world, right, they don't have contacts and deals. That tends to be members. It's a different set of nomenclature than B2B or B2C company, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. For sure. And definitely speak in their language too, because to your point, it's definitely a different space. They have a different set of concerns, a different set of priorities. So things like ROI, I mean, they're important, but they're not as important in the nonprofit space. And so, yeah, you really have to know how to position it specific to that industry. I would say that's not unique to the nonprofit space. I think every industry have to approach a little differently. There's a key difference between like nonprofit and let's say your standard B2B or B2C prospect.
Yes. There's some key differences, buying cycle being one of them. But I think the recent win, I believe it was one of those ones, it wasn't a single team, single tool evaluation here. Give us some background on how they came in, the challenges, and what that looked like, and how you ended up navigating that initial conversation with them.
Yeah. For the sake of this conversation, for the sake of confidentiality, we'll allude to the company, but this is a major nonprofit we were working with. They actually had worked with us on a smaller scale before. So they already were familiar with us on the marketing side of things. And we were included in a CRM eval, and it was between us and Salesforce. I think we're still like very much the upstart in the CRM space, I think. I think Salesforce has an overwhelmingly large amount of market share. So it's great. Again, as somebody who worked here when we were in an incubator, it's great to see us now brought to the table with Salesforce. But anyway, that aside, when we started the conversation, it was very clear that this was more of an internal comms play than it was like donor marketing or volunteer engagement, like things very often were pulled into in the nonprofit space on the marketing side of things. That was number one. Number two, it was very clear, lots of different constituencies, like we talked about before. So we had the system admins, we had the InfoSec folks, we had the folks who were actually in charge of working with different partners outside of the nonprofit. And so it was, again, a matter of telling a story that resonated with the core user, but also addressed some of the bigger problems they were having on the system side and the data consistency side of things.
When you first got involved, what did you find was broken or missing, I guess, from their perspective? And what did they think they needed versus what they actually needed in the end that you were able to take them down that path?
The issue they had is they had a bunch of different divisions that were involved in connecting with partner organizations that they worked with. And each of these divisions had their own CRM or their own system, whatever it was, like Airtable, spreadsheets, Monday.com. A couple were using Salesforce. One was using us. And the issues that they were running into were primarily around coordination, because what would happen is, let's say 2 teams were in touch with the same outside partner. They would both be communicating with that person, unaware of the other person's communications. And so very often they were stepping on each other's toes. They were creating confusion, over communicating. It wasn't the best look. And so they really wanted to consolidate that under one platform to solve the issue. I think one of the things I've noticed about the CRM space in general is that even today, for a lot of larger organizations, it's still an IT-driven process. And so in a lot of cases, you have people looking at it from more of an IT perspective and more of an issue of, does this solve the problem of unifying data? How do we deal with security? How do we deal with user permissions? All that stuff. A lot of times what they miss in that process is this something the team is actually going to be able to use. And the good news here is they were already aware that user adoption was going to be a big deal. And so that was really where we were able to come in and ultimately win this, because from just a clear nuts and bolts functional perspective, Salesforce or HubSpot could do the job, but Salesforce was going to require 10 more admins and 100 additional clicks to get the same thing done in HubSpot. And I think ultimately where we went out was just, number one, it was going to be way easier to administer it, way easier to implement it. And it was also going to be way easier for the end users to adopt. We weren't talking about non-technical folks, but we weren't talking about folks who necessarily wanted to live and breathe in a CRM either. They just wanted something easy that they could get their job done in.
Was the ease of use sale, is that what they came in with, or is that something that you guys directed them towards, or did they come in with that expectation?
They came in with concerns more about adoption.
Okay.
And I think ease of use, we were able to bridge that into ease of use. Everybody has a story about this particular platform or piece of software that they purchased, and then nobody ever used it. It's like the proverbial piece of exercise 100%. Equipment with your laundry hanging off it. Everybody always has an adoption problem or an adoption story with some software. We bought this, nobody ever used it. And sometimes people understand that means ease of use, sometimes people don't. And so I think a lot of times it's up to us to say, hey, the big issue you're going to have with adoption is making sure people understand how to use it. I think they were a little friendlier to it because they already had teams that were in quote unquote easy to use tools. So Monday.com, for example, really easy to use, or Pipedrive, really easy to use. And it's just the problem with those tools is they just don't scale. And so I think one of the advantages we have, I don't want this to turn to a HubSpot infomercial, but you can't stop me. I'm hardwired for it. One of the advantages we have is that we have that ease of use, but we also allow folks to scale.
Yep. I know different stakeholders in the deal, ease of use and adoption, right? Communicating how that translates to platforms, depending on where that stakeholder sits, can mean different things. Walk me through, I guess, what that stakeholder mix was and who was the final decision maker and what the challenges were with the mix of folks that you were chatting with.
I'm going to come out and confess right off the bat. I have no idea who the final decision maker was. I have zero idea. I tried to suss that out. I think it was a decision by committee. And I think that's again, something different about nonprofit. I think they tend to be a little bit more consensus driven than B2B orgs, B2C orgs, private companies, which again, will work by committee, but ultimately, typically there's somebody who's going to put their stamp of approval on it. These folks were definitely way more consensus driven. And the mix was project managers. So folks who were actually going to be in charge of getting people onboarded. That was number one. Number two, we had your IT InfoSec folks, and they were most concerned with how is this going to integrate with our systems, what kind of user permissioning was there, data protection, all that good stuff. And then we had folks in the middle who were, let's call them like systems admins. And these were the folks who are ultimately going to be responsible for keeping the thing humming. And so what we did with this particular deal is we really broke that up into a couple of different calls. So like IT InfoSec had their own call, to answer all their questions. Oddly enough, we had more calls over their concerns than we did with the project managers. Right. The CRM side of things was pretty easy to get done. And then it turned into the wiring underneath. So things like user permissions, integration, stuff like that.
Interesting. Any champions on the IT side, or did you have champions in other areas?
Yeah, they were really great to work with. They were all very amenable to what we had to say. I would say they kept us at arm's length, but they were very clear that this was a level playing field between vendors. And so I wouldn't say we necessarily had a quote unquote champion or somebody who was really like pushing for us. I think it was really up to us to prove the value and prove why we were a fit. IT, we needed to win over. One of the things I would say to anybody selling to a mix of IT folks and then maybe end users or project admins or whatnot is that you also have to be good at selling to IT, and IT is familiar with a small subset of vendors. So for example, the easy button for IT is like Salesforce or Dynamics. It is way easier for IT just to say yes to those two because they're just familiar with them. Because to be frank, those two organizations do a lot of work marketing to that persona. With us, we really had to win them over from that perspective, because that's I think one area where we're not as well known yet is on that side of the fence. And part of the reason is because the software is designed to make IT's job easier. So the software, ideally, HubSpot doesn't have any involvement from IT, or IT just has to do very minimal work. Whereas if they take on a Salesforce, they take on a Dynamics, that's like part of their job. Like they're married to that system forever. And yeah, but to give you the longest possible answer to that very simple question, I think we had to go in and maybe win over IT more than any other constituency in the process. And again, IT wasn't necessarily averse, and they weren't necessarily gunning for a particular vendor. I think there were just more gray areas with us than there were with Salesforce, and they just had to make sure they were exploring those.
Definitely same thing. Dynamics, Salesforce, particularly Dynamics in a very high security environment. It's the easy play. So it's always selling against almost the incumbent there. Did you guys approach that in order to make sure that you addressed it? Because I would love to double click a little bit more and get even more detail there, because I feel like we've all encountered that. And that is one of the biggest challenges, is selling to IT and then demonstrating that HubSpot can support their needs.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was being very detailed with understanding their questions, understanding their concerns, and providing answers. With IT folks, the details are super important. Whereas with other folks, you can speak in broader brush terms. I think our trust center really helps a lot. That has all the documentation IT folks are typically looking for. And once they see you have all that, that tends to put them at ease. And then, of course, having a good partner who is highly technical and can talk the talk, because that is where my experience tops out. So I think that's a big deal. But I think ultimately the other thing is to understand what their core concerns are. And their big concerns are, is this going to break? Is this going to create a lot of extra work for me and my team? And is this secure? Is this going to result in a data breach or some other tech catastrophe? And so I think it's just being very empathetic to that and to those concerns, and making sure that you're giving very clear, very thorough answers and backing it up with documentation.
So making sure that detailed responses address very specific concerns that they may have, having partners that can speak the language and are familiar in these technical environments. How do you get ahead of some of those? Because I know that often in a complex selling scenario, if you don't address that early, often you can get through an entire sales process. You feel like you're ahead, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, and also you have to talk to our IT. And sometimes it could throw you off if you didn't get ahead of that. How do you make sure that you get ahead of that?
Yeah. So the first thing I typically do in a discovery is I get an understanding as to what do things look like from beginning to end. What we like to do is work backwards and say, okay, so your ideal implementation date is X. So let's talk about how long it's going to take to get this set up. And then from there, we determine when exactly they need to start by. And then at that point, we can work backwards and say, okay, what does the approval process look like? What does the InfoSec look like? What does the procurement process look like? Legal. And we really cover all the bases so we can start to tee up what we're going to need to speak to and when. And in some cases, you have IT along for the ride from the get-go. I actually prefer that to the other side, which is they decide they want it and then they bring in IT. And part of the reason is, again, speaking with empathy to the IT persona, they're dealing with people breaking stuff all the time, or people clicking on links they shouldn't have clicked, or something else. That's their whole job. And so a lot of times when they hear, hey, we want to go with this vendor and we need to get started in 2 months, like they're like pumping the brakes right away, because if they're hearing about this for the first time, they've got all those questions, all those concerns popping up. And so I think the earlier you can get them into the process, the better. But that out of the way, I've had success with either. It's really just a matter of making sure, like when you have that call with them, that you have somebody who can speak competently to the technical concerns. And then again, you have all the documentation ready to back that up. And thankfully we do.
Yeah. I love the idea of backing into working backwards from implementation and then backing all the way through. I know we go all the way through planning out what that discovery needs to look like as we're co-selling. Who needs to be involved along the way? What calls do we need to have? What departments need to be involved? Right? Which then starts to bleed into giving them that confidence, and IT the confidence, and all the other departments that, hey, like we've done this before. We're going to get all the information and take everybody's needs into account, since it's a complex deal.
Yeah. And it makes it a lot easier in the back end too, because if you have a date when they need to get started by, or you can anchor that to something that's critical to them, then it's a whole lot easier to move the process along. Because if you understand all the different steps we need to, before you can get started, then it's a lot easier to progress the deal along. I think one of the potholes I see a lot of folks get into who are either new to sales or just starting out with more complex sales is they don't get that understanding and instead are moving with this sort of assumed timeline of demo, security call, sale. And that can lead to a lot of friction. It can lead to a lot of tone-deaf messaging and a lot of things that just make the sales experience unpleasant for the buyer. And especially in the nonprofit space, they move at generally a slower pace overall. And it's being attuned to that and being understanding of that. If you're thinking more about closing the deal or more about your quota than you are like, what do they need and when do they need it by? That's how it's going to come off.
With this one in particular, was there any point through the discovery, right? I know this was something that we planned out, but was there any point in that you had to slow the deal or slow the discovery down intentionally to make sure that didn't break down further down in the discovery process?
For these folks, no. They were ready to be really thorough and really methodical. I think just to offer a contrast to that, you do get some situations where folks just want to jump right into the demo. Or let me just see the software. Those are conversations you have to finesse a bit. I never want to appear like I don't want to show the software. But on the same token, I also don't want to waste everybody's time either. And so in a lot of cases, when you have those people who just want to get to the demo, it's really a matter of telling them like, hey, we can spend an hour, we can spend all day looking at all the features. But if I don't understand what matters to you, I could hit every feature that you don't care about. So let's save time. And rather than doing 3 demos to get to the one you want, let's do 1 discovery call and then 1 demo that's really going to nail the use case.
I love that approach. Would there be any scenario where you would have possibly 2 demos where the first demo, you give them a taste and a feel for the platform, and then the second demo, you've tailored it to what they need?
Yeah, 100%. It's not sales best practice, so I'm not going to give advice to people about this, but you do have to feel it out. There are some cases where folks want to see it before they pull in their entire team. A lot of it's a question of economizing your time for the opportunity. So in my mind, if we have an opportunity where somebody's interested, but we're going to need to pull in other stakeholders in order to get approval, and we may not get those stakeholders in without showing something, then I'll show something. I will do so. Yeah. I'll do some high-level discovery with the understanding we're going to do a deeper disco call after that. And that generally works. And if it doesn't work, it usually means it wasn't going anywhere anyway. So yeah, there are cases like that. It's very situational. I think if I were advising anyone new to sales, I would say don't do that. But after a while, you get a nose for when to go off script. I don't want to say I'm a special person. I don't want to mislead anyone either. So,
well, 16 years, you start to learn a thing or two about a thing or two. And, you can make the exceptions.
I've earned it. I think I've earned it.
So most complex deals, maybe most is a strong word, but I would say many complex deals, they have the moments where it's pivotal, right? It could go sideways. Was there a point in this that had the most risk for this particular, cycle?
I think for us, there wasn't necessarily any areas where things would go sideways with this specific deal because they were very forthcoming about their needs and they were very forthcoming about their evaluation criteria. So in that respect, we knew what we were speaking to. I guess the risk for us was that they were definitely very vendor neutral throughout the process. And I was cool with that. Like I definitely respected the fact that they wanted to run a fair and level evaluation process. Obviously, I would have preferred it if we were the shoe-in and whatever. I would have preferred knowing that would have made me feel better. But I would say for us, the risk was getting into as involved of a sales process as we did without a full understanding as to where we stood against the competition. Because I think when it's just us versus an RFP or us versus a list of requirements, we could say, okay, we meet all these requirements, great. And then the risk is mitigated. When there's a competitor in there, you're just never quite sure where you are. And I think the one thing I've learned to do over time is really allocate my time to where I feel the greatest opportunity is going to be or where I'm going to get the greatest leverage. And I think part of that is understanding exactly where we are in terms of vendor of choice or exactly how far we are away from being vendor of choice or how close we are. Because at that point, if I know we're a little maybe further behind, maybe we're second or third choice, then I know, okay, I'm not going to allocate the same amount of time I would if we were first choice. But in this case, we were always competing for first place. So there was never a sense as to where we stood. And that, again, we could have potentially invested a lot of time and gotten to know. And that's the risk you take. But I feel like with this one, it was worth it, especially since we won it.
Who were they looking at outside of HubSpot?
So it was just HubSpot and Salesforce. That was it. And then they had, and then they did have some incumbents like Airtable. I think Monday was in there. I don't think they ever were seriously entertaining those. I think they knew they needed something with scale, and that was us in Salesforce.
Were they replacing, did they keep Monday or were you integrating with that? Or were they truly using that as a CRM and Airtable?
They were using it as a CRM.
Interesting. Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, you'd be shocked at some of the size of some of the orgs I speak with who are using this sort of mishmash of different tools. In this particular org's case, it made a lot of sense because there was some autonomy to the different teams. But I've seen teams with like sales reps. I've seen sales teams of 1,000 people working off spreadsheets. That's sometimes so. Yeah. So I know I've got job. As long as people are doing that, I've got job security. So I'm feeling okay about that.
I know particularly nonprofits can be sometimes difficult to get a temperature check as you're going through the sales process and really understanding or getting a feel for, are we the leading contender? Was there any point during this where you felt a tip from, hey, we're a really strong contender, to like, we are the contender and this is likely to move forward?
Yeah, like at the very end. I hope when I say this, it comes off as an extreme compliment to these folks because they ran such a professional evaluation process. I don't think I knew until maybe 2 weeks before we got the official thumbs up that we were getting the thumbs up. And that was after all the calls were done. So like we had already done all the work we were going to need to do in there. And then they were like, hey, we don't want to say anything just yet, but we think you all are in a pretty strong position. And I would ask them constantly. I'd say, listen, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask. Like, where do we stand?
You got to ask.
They gave me the Heisman every single time until the last moment.
I know we're coming up on time a bit, but looking back at that deal, is there anything you would have done differently or approached differently? What are the reflections?
Great question. I hate to say this because I know this is supposed to be a learning moment, but with this specific deal, I think we did everything we should have done and did it all in the right sequence. I think, and maybe to make this a little more informative, it's funny, getting back to my roots in stand-up, nobody ever wants to hear about the show when you kill it. Everybody wants to hear about when you bomb the worst. This is the thing about stand-up comics. When you see a comic bombing up there, just know that in the back of their mind, they're thinking about how they're going to talk to all their stand-up friends about this afterwards, because those are the stories people want to hear. And in this particular case, this was one where we nailed it. I think, again, there was some vagueness around where we stood as vendor of choice, but on the whole, the process was pretty solid. If I had to offer something, though, that was a little more prescriptive or maybe a little more educational for anyone listening, what I would say is that in a lot of cases, we view our sales process almost as a set of requirements, almost like an RFP, where if I get this, then I give that. If I get this, then I give that, and so on and so forth. So if I get all of the stakeholders, then I give a demo, and I need to know timeline, and I need to know who signs, and I need to know all this, right? And all that's true, and all that's sound, and you should be getting all that information. And you also have to understand that all that information exists to make you feel better. It doesn't deliver any value to your prospect at all. Your prospect knows this, right? They don't need to have that information. You need that information. And so I think what's really important to understand about any sales process, but especially ones that are more complex, is you really have to view it almost as an exercise in risk management. And the thing you're managing is your limited time. And the risks are any vagueness in the process. Those checkboxes you're supposed to mark off before you proceed to the next step, those are all designed to keep you from spending too much time on folks who aren't qualified, because that will be the kiss of death. In this specific instance, I think there was an acceptable level of vagueness that we had to navigate through, and that was the toughest part of it. But I would also say, again, just as advice to anyone selling, really think of those qualification questions and think of everything from timeline to compelling event as little pieces of evidence as to how much time to invest in that. And I think if you do that, you're going to gear your process much more to the prospect, to the person looking at it. You're going to be able to frame those questions in a way that matters to them rather than matters to you. And you're also going to be able to know exactly where you should be spending your time.
I love it. If somebody is listening, and I feel like you might have already answered this one, but if somebody's listening who's early in their HubSpot sales career, what's the biggest mistake they should avoid on deals like this?
Oh, I'm going to say the exact opposite of what I said. I would say that the biggest mistakes are, number one, not having a clear understanding as to the prospect's timeline and why that timeline is important. If you understand when and why, you understand most of what you need to know about whether that deal is going to close or not. And I think if the when and why are compelling, then you can backfill the rest. If you don't understand the when and why, then you really run the risk of wasting your time. And with a complex deal, these are a lot of calls, there's a lot of prep time, and they're long processes, and you can burn up, and I've done it. I burned up a lot of time with deals that weren't going anywhere. And that sets you back, because for every hour you're spending on a deal that isn't going anywhere, that's an hour you could spend on LinkedIn prospecting for new deals, or in your database, or maybe prepping for deals that have some legs. And so I would say really gain an understanding as to why the prospect is looking, why that's important, when that problem needs to be solved by. And then, like I said, you can backfill the rest from there.
That's perfect. Last question before we wrap it all up.
Yep.
What is something about you, personally, professionally, that most people either don't know or wouldn't expect?
Don't know or wouldn't expect. Oh, I'm full of surprises, Stephen. I'm full of surprises. I'll tell you something now. So I'm a big language geek. I actually, when I started at HubSpot, we only had the office in Cambridge, and we had a ton of leads coming in from overseas. And so they needed somebody who was willing to get up early in the morning and talk with folks in Europe. And now at the time, I had a bunch of small kids, and I hadn't slept through the night since 2007 anyway. So I was like, fine, I'll go and do it. And it worked very well with my schedule, because I was working from 5, usually till about like noon, 1 or whatever, really child-friendly hours. And I really got used to it, really liked it. And then I got to a point where I thought, if I'm going to stay in this role, I really should know another language. So I talked to our international recruiter, and he was like, Brazilian Portuguese is in high demand. So I taught myself Brazilian Portuguese, got competent enough, like I can have a conversation. I can't sell HubSpot in Portuguese. I can get around okay. I fell in love with learning languages. And so right now, I'm actually, my side project is I am building an app to learn Hungarian using a lot of different AI tools, a lot of vibe coding tools, and really using it as a dual. I don't think we have time for me to explain why I want to learn Hungarian, but just as you might imagine, not a lot of resources to learn Hungarian. So I just decided to build my own, and it also allowed me to get really familiar, the potential for AI to do custom coding and build apps. I've gotten to do some API work. So it's just really helped me better understand the full potential. I could speak more intelligently about it at work. And I think my technical chops have gone up quite a bit. So now when my sales engineer and the IT person at one of my prospect companies starts talking about API, I don't have to put myself on mute and zone out. I actually know what they're talking about and can add some value there. So that's my surprise. Is that surprising?
I love it. Okay, right. So Portuguese. So funny enough, some of our best friends are Brazilian, and we don't speak Portuguese. They do. So I'm familiar with it. I don't think I know a single word, but that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, a próxima vez deveríamos falar português. Send that to your friends. Send that to your Brazilian friends, so they'll translate for you.
I feel like we should have had some sort of stand-up portion of this to take advantage of the comedy here, but
I tried to be funny.
Maybe for next time.
Next time.
Awesome. Dan, thanks for joining us. This was really fun. This was a fun one. I really appreciate you breaking down how everything worked, why it worked, and selling in this complex environment with the larger nonprofits. So appreciate you being here.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. You can find me, Steven Saberin, on LinkedIn if you want to keep the conversation going. Check out aptitude8.com to learn how we're helping HubSpot sellers and solutions teams win more complex deals. Until next time, keep selling, keep learning, and keep dominating.